Hello and welcome to another edition of From the Pastor's Heart. It's been a while since I've done a longer form video for this particular podcast, and so if it's okay with you, I'm going to do that. I'm going to actually spend the next 4 weeks looking at something I think is really important, and that is how Christianity has changed the world. But there's no doubt that Christianity is losing not only acceptance, but also influence in our world today. In fact, we know that Christianity is still the largest religion on the planet, but the gap is narrowing. In 2015, worldwide Christians in all of its forms made up 31.2% of the population. Islam is second at 24.1%. And scholars believe that by 2070, Islam will be the largest religion in the world. We know that Islam is by far the fastest growing religion worldwide, and Christianity is losing the battle for the hearts of people, especially in the West. That is in North America and in Europe. I mean, just think about this, folks. Atheists make up about 3.1% of the American population. Christians, or those who consider themselves Christians, make up 75% of the population, and the atheists are pushing us around. Of course, that begs the question, how can this possibly be? Well, I think the reason is because the church has not learned the lesson that whoever controls the narrative will eventually win the battle for the minds and the hearts of people. The narrative over the years is that religion, especially Christianity, is the root of all social evils in the history of the world. And we're given examples like the Spanish Inquisition and the Crusades, along with the favored slam of slavery to bring home the point. And these are the foundation for the newest wave of evils of Christianity. Now we are anti-science, we hate women, we hate gay people, we hate transgendered people, and we are determined to force our morality on others and hate anyone who does not agree with us. The thing that saddens me the most is that many in the church agree with what I just said. Now, I have said this repeatedly. It is time for Christians to take back the narrative. Because you see, folks, the truth is that the organism known as the church has been the greatest movement for good in the history of our world. Now, that does not mean that the organization known as the church has not had a rocky history. It has. But we need to remember that Jesus said that there would be both believers and non-believers or pagans in the organization of the church. And evil people will infiltrate, and many will come into positions of power and authority. But the true church has always been a force for good in the world. And so today I want to begin with a journey through history. And I hope to show you how Christianity has changed the world for good. My prayer is that as we look at how Christians have impacted their world and in fact saved millions of lives, we will be able to glean a few of the principles that guided these many witnesses, and that we would be armed to run the race in order to gain the prize. And so I want to begin, we're going to spend 4 weeks on this. I want to begin this look through history by looking at the sanctity of human life. And so in order to do that, first of all, we need to go back to the world of the early church so that we can see how the early church made an impact and how they changed the world's understanding of the value of life. And so in Rome, the low value of life among the Romans was a shocking affront to the early church. And I want to talk about 2 areas of heinous behavior that the early church fought, and whose practices they would effectively end. I say effectively because sin is still sin, and selfish people will always find ways to sin and fulfill the selfish desires. But the issue was changing society's views, which in turn changed the laws concerning these practices. So the first practice I want to look at is the practice of abortion. You see, the low view of life among the Greco-Roman world showed itself in the widespread abortion practices. Historians who, when forced to admit the practice, they tend to cite poverty or food shortage as the primary reason for abortion in the Roman world. The problem is the historical record does not support this claim, the claim that poverty was the primary reason for abortion in the Roman world. In fact, there were two primary reasons that women would murder their preborn children. And I want us to see how much things have not changed. First of all was the low view of marriage and the subsequent sexual promiscuity that resulted from this view of marriage. Historians record for us that the Roman honor and respect for marriage had virtually become extinct. In fact, Roman marriage deprived of all moral character, as the historian Charles Schmidt has noted, was no longer a sacred bond and alliance of souls. Because of this low view of marriage, the result was rampant infidelity. Wives had no rights. In fact, they weren't appreciated, and men were encouraged to sleep with whomever they wanted. The Roman historian Seneca said that who was a Roman moralist, called unchastity the greatest evil of our time. Women began to follow in their husbands' paths. Now, of course, the problem was that there was very little consequences for men who sleep around. Women, on the other hand, had huge consequences. Namely, they could get pregnant. Now, it's not easy to hide a pregnancy, and many Roman men didn't want to spend the money raising the child, and it was just simply easier to get rid of the wife than take responsibility for the child. And so this meant that the woman would need to get rid of the proof of their infidelity, and so the child must die. Now, the second reason for widespread abortion was the desire to be childless. Seneca also said that childlessness bestows more influence than it takes away. And the loneliness that used to be a detriment to old age now leads to much power that some old men, in fact, pretend to hate their sons and disown their children, and by their acts make themselves childless. So unmarried people and childless couples were courted by all kinds of people who wanted to benefit from their wills. And so people liked this kind of attention. It was almost like a badge of honor to take control of your life. And children, unfortunately, got in the way. I hope you can see the fact that things haven't changed much. Solomon said that there's nothing new under the sun, and he actually did, in fact, mean that. That's exactly the world in which we live today. Now, the second evil that we look at is the evil of infanticide. Now, we know that abortion was available in the early days of pregnancy, but there came a point where later term abortions were just simply too risky. And so women would hide their pregnancy until the baby was born, and then they would kill them shortly after they were born. Now, I would liken this to later term abortions that are practiced, unfortunately, today. The historian Frederick Farrar has noted that infanticide was infamously universal among the Greeks and the Romans during the early years of Christianity. Infants were killed for various reasons. Those who were born deformed or physically frail, like those who may have Down syndrome today, were especially prone to being willfully murdered, often by drowning. Some were killed more brutally. For instance, Plutarch mentions that the Carthaginians, he says that they offered up their own children, and those who had no children would buy the little ones from poor people and cut their throats, as if they were so many lambs or young birds. Meanwhile, the mother stood by without a tear or even a moan. Today, we tear babies apart in the womb. And then we sell their parts for profit to quote-unquote researchers, and very few people seem to care about it. Large families were frowned upon in Roman society. And boys, of course, were much more valuable than girls, and so it was very rare for even a wealthy Roman family to have more than one daughter. Now, there was no ultrasound technology back then, so when a girl was born, they would simply murder her instead. Now, folks, this was the world that the early church found themselves in. This was a world in which they were called to make a difference, and they did. I want to talk about how they made that difference. What did they do? Well, this is the most important thing that they were able to do. They were able to change the narrative. And so I want to spend the rest of this video talking about three things. How they changed the narrative. First of all, I want to talk about the rationale of the early Christians, the practice of the early church, and then again, what that means for us today. So we look at the rationale of the early Christians. As I said earlier, that the early Christians were appalled by the Roman view of the sanctity of life. Now, why is that? It's because they had a very different starting point. The early Christians believed that the Bible was true and they lived accordingly. They believed that all human beings were made in the image of God. Now, remember that the Romans and Christians had very different understandings of the origins of mankind. The Romans believed the world was created by an impersonal, cruel gods, and that we are the byproduct of chaos and destruction. And the result of this belief was that humans had no inherent value. And the early Christians believed in an all-powerful God who spoke the universe into existence. And they also believed that God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them, from Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. For you see, of all that God created, humankind is different. Because it's only man that bears the image of God. And because of this image, yes, it's been marred by the fall. I don't argue that. But because of this image, mankind, even babies, wanted or not, have inherent worth. They believe that David spoke the truth when he wrote these words, when he said, "For you formed my inward parts, you knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, and my soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them." In Psalm 139. You see, they believed with Jeremiah that God has a plan for each human being. Where God told Jeremiah in Jeremiah chapter 1, he said, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations." Now, I could go on and on about the passages that deal with the value of human life. But the point is, the early church believed them. They were not just stories that were nice in Sunday school or sermons that were nodded to and then people went on their way and did their own thing. The early church was convinced that all people, born or pre-born, have the God-given right to life. Not only did they believe that, but they actually did something about it. You see, the first thing that the early church did, it may seem trivial, but it paid huge dividends. What was it? They maintained their witness. The early Christians not only called out the sin of abortion, but they taught two very positive principles as the foundation for this call to action. And the first is that they affirmed the beauty of marriage. They practiced monogamy in a world where polygamy was the norm. They understood that marriage was a covenant between not only two persons, but between those persons and God himself. They reveled in the reality that in Christian marriage, the curse was being systematically undone. The contentment and happiness that was a part of the Christian marriage was noticed in the world. Adultery was strictly forbidden in the early church. In fact, we're told that after we are married, we no longer belong to ourselves, but we belong to our spouse. And in Christian marriage, there was no reason to stray. But the second thing they did was they affirmed the beauty of the family. They understood that children are not a curse to hinder our upward mobility, but they are actually a gift from God. Christians are called to raise children to inherit a new kingdom order. They raise boys and girls to be a force for good in the world. And I believe that they focused on these two issues because these were the two leading reasons for killing children in the Greco-Roman world. But folks, they were not afraid to call out these despicable acts. In fact, Paul in Galatians chapter 5, verse 20, lays out a series of behaviors and practices that are abhorrent to those who are led by the Spirit. Among the list of the works of the flesh are idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, and others. Now I want to focus on the word that the ESV translates as sorcery. The word is pharmakeia. And it's the word from which we get pharmacy or pharmaceuticals. And it means the making and administering of potions. Now, the word frequently translated as sorcery or witchcraft, and it was translated that way because potions were often made in a context of sorcery. It's possible that Paul used this word to indicate the practice of abortion because the common way to induce an abortion was with a potion. Remember, they did this early in the pregnancy. In fact, once the baby got too big, they would wait and they would kill it after he or she was born. And this possibility is reinforced by John's use of the word in Revelation 21:8. He uses the word right after he mentions sexual immorality. We might call it the day after pill would be a form of sorcery and how they would understand it in the first century. So the first readers would have connected the practice of abortion in order to hide sexual immorality. Folks, we're doing the same thing with the abortion pill that can get sent out to even states where they banned abortion. So now we've turned every bathroom into an abortion clinic. And we've done that by the use of sorcery. So church leaders would routinely call out the secular leaders because they condone the killing of innocent people among them. In fact, for instance, Athenagoras, a Christian philosopher and layman, who was writing about 177 to the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, defended his fellow Christians against the preposterous charge of cannibalism that stemmed from the Christians' belief they received the body and blood of Christ in the Lord's Supper. And in fact, he forcefully responded. He said, what reason would we, Christians, have to commit murder when we say that women who induce abortion are murderesses? Tertullian, who died in 220, the Latin church father in northern Africa, stated the Christian view by saying this. He said, we may not destroy even the fetus in the womb. Nor does it matter whether you take away the life that is born or destroy the one that is coming to birth. By the beginning of the 4th century, it wasn't just individual Christian theologians who voiced opposition to abortion, but it was the entire church. The people in the church saying this practice needed to be abolished. Now, many of them paid for their witness with their lives, but they knew that they were called to stand up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. And they were able to curtail the practice in pagan Rome until Christianity became the official religion of Rome. And then they could make real changes in the secular laws. Now, the fourth thing I want us to see that they did, and I think this is so important for us today, is that they did not accept incremental changes. You see, there was no cry in the early church of safe, legal, and rare. It didn't exist. Now, of course, we know that was the mantra of the 1990s. The early church had no use for incremental changes. They called abortion and infanticide what they are, murder. It is no less murder at 20 weeks than it is at 6. The baby is still dead. And they never let up the pressure because they believed that life was too precious. But they also brought hurting people into the church. In fact, the early Christians would actually go to the river where babies were being drowned, and they would try to fish them out before they died. And they would raise these children up as their own, and they would teach them about Jesus. They would get involved in the lives of people. In fact, they were known as a place where people are accepted and where they can find forgiveness and mercy. And the church would take in pregnant women and help them care for their children. Now, where I live in Connecticut, we support an incredible center, the ABC, or A Better Choice Center, who is following in the footsteps of the early church. And if you have a pro-life center in your society, in your town, they're doing exactly that. They're just following what has been going on in the early church since the first century. You see, hurting people knew where they could turn for help. Now we know that life in the kingdom of God was very different from life in the Roman world. So I want to finish this up by asking this question. What does this mean for us? Well, I think the first thing that we need to do is admit the sin around us. In fact, too many in the church are afraid of calling sin, sin. Taking an innocent life is murder, pure and simple. And it's time that we call things for what they are. The early church was a master of controlling the narrative, even when it wasn't convenient. And I think that we need to, for example, stop using the word abortion and call it what it is. It's a premeditated murder of an innocent child. It's not health care. It is not a woman's right over her body. It is not a choice. It's a child. And we need to stop splitting hairs. I have heard pastors talk about this exception, that exception, maybe the exception for rape and incest. And folks, I'll be honest with you, they're just absolute pure evil. Two wrongs never make a right. And yes, as horrible as those sins are that were perpetrated against a woman, it's not the child's fault. The child does not deserve to be killed. Maybe the one who perpetrated on that's a different argument. But the innocent child has done nothing wrong. And we need to teach young men that women are to be valued and respected. Young men need to understand that when they go out with someone, they are actually going out with someone who will probably someone's wife someday, either his or somebody else's, and they need to treat her accordingly. We must not be afraid to talk about God's plan for sexuality. And those in the world know that the sexual freedom does not, in fact, bring freedom. And I think we need to reaffirm the truth that all persons, born or not born, yet are persons who bear the image of God. And because of that, they have inherent worth and dignity, and they deserve being born. And lastly, folks, we need to share the good news that God is faithful to forgive the worst kinds of sin. In fact, so many young people feel as though they can't go to their Christian families because somehow they'll meet scorn and condemnation. So parents, make sure your children know that Jesus is willing to forgive any sin. And for goodness sake, follow the Lord's example. So I praise God for ministries like in my town, the ABC Center. They are at the van of this battle in Middletown, Connecticut. Pray for them. Get involved. Support the work they do, or any crisis pregnancy center in and around the area that you live. Because you see, folks, our society has gotten to the point where we mirror the world of the early church. We have gotten here because the church has dropped the ball and abdicated our role in the world. And we can make a difference if we follow the steps of that the early church did. It took them centuries to complete the change. We don't have that much time left. We need to not look at changing the world, but we need to focus on bringing the light of Jesus into our sphere of influence. And that's how we can actually make a change. Because you see, folks, we need to understand, like the early church did, it actually is a matter of life and death. So I thank you for making it to the end of this diatribe, if you want to call it. But folks, I think that if we were to simply follow the path that was set before us, the path that the early church set for us, I think that we can actually make a difference in our society, because we know it's possible because they did just that. And so I pray that as you are gathering with your siblings in Christ this week and you're worshiping the Lord, that you have an incredible time in God's presence. And I look forward to seeing you again in a future video. God bless y'all.